before I go ahead and introduce Christopher, particularly for the people that have not been to one of our meetings before, or maybe have been to a meeting but not recently, I thought it would be worthwhile to mention the topics that we've been looking at the last 2 months before this one, because there's a connection there, and we might as well get it before you. The first of these two addressed the Israel-Palestine issue that was very much in the news and very much of concern to all of us. And then we followed it a month later by the screening of the film, The Zionist Story. Some may wonder why these topics have what they have to do with 9/11 Truth. An explanation we have put on our website, and it states, the Zionist story tells of the events that brought about and continued to support the Jewish state of Israel. The mainstream media was and still is controlled by Zionists. Thus, the media told and tells a story in a way that hides that key role. It was, in a sense, a false flag, in that it blamed the negative aspects brought about by the Zionists on peoples or states other than the Zionists or Israel. This is, in essence, a false flag, and the reason it is presented by the 9/11 Truth on their website, because we have a section called Other False Flags. In fact, our website received a comment strongly critical of us, saying, quote, "I'm sure that everything you screen would be one-sided and anti-Semitic," unquote. I'll read a portion of our response that is on our website to that letter writer. Quote, "The mainstream media presents the Israeli side, although it doesn't label it as such. However, this narrative can't be taken as objective truth. Chris Hedges, in the blog Truth Dig, posted on August 3rd, 2014, titled Why Israel Lies, discusses this issue. His quote, "As a vivid example of how the mainstream media knowingly publishes Israel lies as if they were truth," Hedges stated, "I, along with every other reporter I know who has worked in Gaza, have never seen any evidence that Hamas uses civilians as human shields." This brings us to the fortunate happenstance that Christopher Bollyn is traveling in California in connection with several of the September 11th anniversary events. Bollyn is an American journalist living in Sweden and author of the book, which he's been back at his table with, Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. In 2006, Bollyn worked closely with Professor Stephen E. Jones, examining and documenting the scientific evidence supporting Jones' thermite theory. In the wake of the groundbreaking work, Jones was put on leave and eventually retired from Brigham Young University, and Bollyn and his family were ultimately forced into exile after Bollyn was attacked by unscrupulous police and obstructed by a corrupted justice system. In his book, Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World, Bollyn not only connects the dots, he succinctly pulls back the curtain to reveal what one reviewer called, quote, "perhaps the most powerful and sadistic mob masquerading as the most sacred of sacred cows in human history," unquote. That mob bears a strong resemblance of the evildoers we've been studying the past 2 months. Please help me welcome Christopher Bollyn.
It's nice to see you all. It's a wonderful crowd. This is amazing, really. This is a very well organized group. I think you better take that away for now. Yeah. a very well-organized group, and they really did a great job in bringing you all out here tonight. I'm Christopher Bollyn. I may not sound like it, but I'm from Chicago. I was born there, and I grew up in a place called Hoffman Estates, Illinois, which is in Schaumburg Township, northwest suburb of Chicago. As Dwayne said, I've been living in Sweden for the last 5 years. I've been in Europe for the last 7 years after I was a case of malicious prosecution. I was prosecuted after 3 undercover police came to my house and assaulted me. I was prosecuted for having assaulted them and resisting their arrest. These are people who were completely unidentified, who wore no sort of markings except blue bulletproof vests or Kevlar vests. And they were dressed like in blue jeans and t-shirts. And they came up to my house, and they had been going around my house for several days, and I asked them, who are you? And they wouldn't identify themselves. But that's after being prosecuted, we decided after living through a year of hell that for my family's benefit, and we should relocate. So the judge graciously gave me a 3-week period before sentencing, and we fled to Canada and to Norway. A little brief note that's very important is this is Solving 9/11. This is the big book. Solving 9/11 is a set of books, which means they both have the same Library of Congress number because it's a 2-volume set. The main book is called Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World, which is the basic thesis presented in a very concise, easily very readable format. But I've been writing about 9/11 as a professional journalist first from 2001. I was in New York City, happened to be passing through on September 11th, and I began writing about it immediately because I was a weekly journalist. I was an investigative journalist. I wrote for a little newspaper in Washington, D.C. And the articles that I wrote from September 2001 until April 2012 are in this book. This is called Solving 9/11, the original articles. So if you've read the Deception That Changed the World, and if you might have some questions about some elements or details, it would be in this book. Now, you understand the basics of 9/11. I understand this is a very, very politically savvy crowd. You understand the basics. You've seen people like Richard Gage. You understand the basic problems with the government version, saying that the towers collapsed with gravitational collapse caused by fire. Where my book is different from other books on the subject is that my work focuses more on who did 9/11, not how it was done, but who did it. I write a lot about also how it was done. But the real concern is who did this terrible thing? Who's behind this criminal act? Who killed 2,700 people in broad daylight in New York City and then had the wherewithal to cover it up, to conceal it, and to deceive the American people? Now, that's a pretty tall order to understand, but my hypothesis that this was an Israeli operation began basically on the first day almost, because we had been in New York City early in the morning driving through, and we couldn't go further to Washington, D.C., obviously, after the Pentagon attack. So I called the office and I said, I'm going back to Chicago. We had been on a little tour with a car and my children. So on September 11th at about noon, I think it was Ted Koppel came on the air and said that there were 5 Middle Eastern men who had been seen celebrating and videotaping the collapse of the World Trade, or the attacks on the World Trade Center, and that these 5 men were being sought by the FBI. Well, that's interesting. Okay, this is the first Middle Eastern connection there. The next day, Paulo Lima, a journalist with the Bergen Record in New Jersey, wrote an article in which these men had been identified. They'd been arrested by New Jersey police in the afternoon, and it turned out that these 5 men were indeed Israeli intelligence agents. 2 of them were known agents of Mossad. The other 3 men were operatives. And these chaps were driving a moving van. They had been filming the attack on the World Trade Center. And as the towers, this is on the Jersey side in New Jersey, near Liberty City. behind them, as the towers were burning, they were doing things like high fives, jubilating, and clicking lighters like people do in football games or soccer games that, hey, good job. And they were quite happy. And a woman happened to observe them from her apartment and said, these guys looked like they were really happy. They were ecstatic that the towers were attacked. Well, the New Jersey police caught these men, found that they were Israelis, but immediately the case was turned over to the FBI. Now, the van they were driving in had tested positive for explosives. They had multiple passports. They had box cutters. They fit all of the descriptions of these chaps who did 9/11. In the process of writing about this story, I also contacted the Israeli embassy and asked them how many Israelis have been detained by the FBI at this point. And it was scores of Israelis at that point. It was like, I think she said it was like at least 60 or something like that. So a lot of Israelis have been apprehended. You don't hear about that. But Paulo Lima, he identified the names of these men. He said that they were Israelis. But the interesting thing is that he's in New Jersey writing in the Bergen Record, which is right across the Hudson River from New York City. But this story did not get repeated in the New York papers at all. So many Americans have never heard about it. These are called the 5 dancing Israelis. Then there was the story about the Odigo instant messaging. This is the messaging system that enabled people to send messages to a specific group of people immediately, and that the messages would be received, whether you had a pager or a cell phone or an internet connection, you would get that message. And there were some 4,000 Israelis who did not appear at work on 9/11. They were expected to be at work because the Israeli Foreign Ministry had received calls from their parents or their loved ones in Israel. And they wanted to know about the safety of their loved ones. Were they alive? Were they okay? And they got 4,000 calls. And this was reported in the Jerusalem Post in the week after 9/11. But what the Odigo system allowed, it told people that there would be an attack at the World Trade Center, and it was specific to the minute. And it was probably written in Hebrew language because the employees of Odigo in Israel received the same message. And it said, do not go to the World Trade Center. There will be an act of terrorism there at 8:45. So apparently, evidently, these 4,000 Israelis had received this message and didn't go to work. They didn't call the chief of police. They didn't call the fire department. They didn't call the mayor of New York and say, there's going to be something happening at the World Trade Center at 8:45. They simply didn't go to work and let other people die. This is pretty outrageous. Well, these two stories were reported in the New York Times and the Washington Post. You know, the FBI sent a team to Israel to check out the Odigo message, to find out who sent the message. That story was reported in the New York Times once and only once. What the FBI found in Israel, we never heard. But the fact is that at this point, these 3 things indicated to me that the hypothesis that Israel has knowledge of the attacks, prior knowledge of the attacks, is very strong. They obviously had prior knowledge. These chaps who were videotaping the attack on the World Trade Center, unfortunately they were jubilating. That was pretty stupid. But that shows that they knew there would be an attack. And we know that the Odigo message, that 4,000 other people, or whoever got this message on the Odigo system, they knew there would be an attack. Well, that clearly shows that a lot of Israelis knew there would be an attack. So that became my working hypothesis. So I began looking to see if there was more evidence of Israeli involvement in 9/11. And I found quite a bit. I wrote in 2001, 2002, I wrote a lot of articles, discovered, for example, many things of great importance. Like I learned in 2002 that at the bottom of the World Trade Center, when they got down to the bedrock of Manhattan, they found pools of molten iron. They called it molten steel. They found in the molten state, like in a foundry. Well, that was important. And things like that. And then I continued my work, and I wrote the book. I mean, I was writing articles on a weekly basis as a working journalist. And then in 2005, we made a discovery that it indicated that this molten iron that was found in the basement had been created by something called thermite. Thermite is a very simple chemical reaction between aluminum and rust, which is ferrous oxide. If you have this stuff in powder form, you mix these two elements together like sand, and if you put a little wick in there with a high temperature wick, it will detonate and it'll melt anything that it's on top of, because it produces molten iron, which is very hot. Reaction temperature is about 2,500 degrees Celsius, very hot, and it produces white smoke. Okay, the white smoke is the aluminum oxide. So the oxygen goes, it's an oxygen reaction, and that's what you have. And if you look at the pictures of the World Trade Center when they were hit by the planes, if you look carefully, you will notice a great amount of white smoke coming out of, for example, the North Tower. When the North Tower is struck, a huge amount of white smoke comes out one side. Like if this is the North Tower, the plane comes in, it hits this side, for example, and a huge amount of white smoke comes shooting out here, it looks like a giant bale of cotton. Well, there's no explanation for this. The exploding jet fuel, the plane, nothing would produce such white smoke. The burning kerosene produces a dark orange flame with a lot of black soot around it. This is indicative of thermite. And when I wrote an article about the discovery of the molten iron that they found in 2002, and some people wrote to me, one man wrote to me, I didn't know his name, but he said that this sounds like thermite. Well, years later, in 2005, Professor Jones from BYU writes to me and asks me, tell me exactly, Mr. Bollyn, tell me exactly what you know about this. What did they tell you? Because I had spoken to the contractors that removed the steel, Peter Tully and Mark Loiseau of Controlled Demolition Incorporated. And they told me that they had found steel at the bottom. They couldn't account for it. They don't know how it got there, but that's what they saw. That's what they found. And these are the people that oversaw the removal of the steel. Now, there's one thing you have to understand about the demolition at the World Trade Center. The only thing that was left, according to these people, was steel and dust. And you saw the dust. The dust went all over Manhattan. The dust went to Brooklyn. It went into the ocean and to the Hudson River. You saw it go, 10 stories high, dust clouds. Now, those dust clouds were very, very hot. If you listen to people who were touched by those clouds, or if you see the cars that were affected by these clouds, they're burned and scorched. William Rodriguez, who was right outside the North Tower, hiding under a fire truck, protecting himself under a fire truck, he said when that blast of dust came through, it burned his leg. It just burned the side of his leg. It's very hot. So Professor Jones wanted to know more about this, and he wanted me to get some of the dust in 2006, spring of 2006. Well, what eventually he got is he got 6 people in Manhattan, or in that area, to send in the dust that they had collected in their house, or off their windowsill, or on their car. 6 people sent dust, which was basically the pulverized World Trade Center. It's basically the concrete floors, the 4-inch concrete floors that were pulverized, and sadly, everything that was on those floors. People, filing machines, computers, human debris, human life, human beings were in there. All of that was pulverized. And that was in those dust clouds. Well, Professor Jones looked at this dust at BYU, and he found little red chips, little bilayered material that looked like paint. He thought it was a form of a primer or something. But when you heated these little chips to 420 degrees Celsius, they detonated, they exploded with more energy per gram than any known explosive. So this is very important. This discovery was then came out in a peer-reviewed scientific paper with a team of international scientists, 9 of them, and to my mind, this was the nail in the coffin of the official version, because here we have evidence to support what the eyewitnesses had seen. But this is not to say that this material was the only thing that was used on 9/11, because there were obviously powerful explosions that went off in the basement before the towers even were hit. There were explosions in the core, which threw material sideways. So this discovery, though, was a discovery that was not supposed to be made, because when it was made, I was attacked, Professor Jones was attacked. In fact, when I put the two pieces together about the dust and the evidence of the smoke that rose from the pile, you see, the smoke that rose from the pile for 3 months was extremely laden with nanoparticles. And I asked the professor in Davis, California, if he could explain what would produce these nanoparticles of these materials, these metals, in the smoke. And he said only temperatures hotter than the boiling point of the metal. So I wrote an article then, which is in the main book, Why Did Iron Boil Beneath the World Trade Center Rubble? Well, when I made that discovery, connected the Provo research with the Davis research, I got a call from my newspaper in Washington, D.C., and they cut my travel allowance from $1,000 a month to zero, which meant I had to go home. And in my home in Chicago, in Schaumburg, Illinois, we had been surveilled by FBI informants for several years, which is why we didn't live there. My wife didn't feel comfortable with that. I didn't feel comfortable with that. We have 2 little kids. We don't like it that the FBI is sending people to our house every day to ask about our comings and goings. They pretended to be your friends. That's how they befriend you. But then, actually, in our case, they told us, we're working for the FBI. Oh, thank you very much. There were 4 of them, because they wanted to intimidate me, let me know that we're watching you. We're watching you. Well, as soon as I got home to Chicago, to my home, after we had to go home because you can't live on the road with no money, just with your salary. So we went to our house, and this was in August 2006. And immediately, the local police started going around my house in most unusual numbers, frequency. And then, for example, the first day I got there, the drain in the utility room wasn't working, so I had to go up on the roof to put a router down the vent. And I'm working on the roof early in the morning, and a Hoffman Estates police car pulls up right in front of my house, looks at me, and he stops the car in the middle of the road, and he's looking at me. He's like, what, you've never seen a person working on the roof before? He's making a note, Mr. Bollyn is home now, okay? Now the plan can go ahead. So it's like the paper I worked for was working hand in hand with the Hoffman Estates police. Then this attack happened. I won't go into details, but these 3 undercover officers came to my house after I had seen them for 2 days going around my house, looking out the window like this, and they drove in front of my house. And they attacked me in the afternoon. They came up up the driveway. I had called 911. I had said this car is going around my house, and these 3 men that are obviously armed for bear are driving around my neighborhood. I don't understand this. And they said, we'll send a uniformed officer to your house. But instead of the uniformed officer, this tactical squad hijacked the call, intercepted the call, said, car 31, you don't go, we'll go. And so they came and they tasered me and all that, and then charged me with assaulting them. So, I think we can take a few questions now. That would be probably the best thing to do, because I know that in this crowd, so diverse, so many intelligent people, I think that you might have some questions that would be very interesting for others. So would somebody like to start off with a question? Yes, sir.
Did you have your phone, any evidence of your phone being tapped?
It's a good question. As I did my research, we didn't have a landline at home. We didn't use a cell phone. I would go to the Schaumburg Library and use the payphone there when I made my phone calls, just for prudence sake. Yes, sir.
Were you charged with a crime by the prosecutor or any?
Yes. I was charged. As I said, I was charged. I came out my driveway. I saw my wife had stopped these men as they came up our driveway. My little daughter was next to her. My wife had been gardening in the backyard, and she had seen the car drive in front of our house. She went to see who it was. They had blocked the driveway. She came out from the side of the house, went down the driveway. She had her gardening shears in her hand, and she stopped these 3 men as they came up the driveway. And she said, "Who are you? And what do you want?" And one man reached in his back pocket and pulled out an Illinois driver's license. He just held it up from a distance. There was some 3 or 4 meters between them. He held up a license. That's all he showed. They didn't say they were police or anything. Since I had the person who had called, I had called 911. I looked out the kitchen window and I said, my God, these are the guys that I'm calling. They've come to the house. So if I was prudent, if I was smart, I would have stayed in the house, hidden in the crawl space even. But no, I went out there right by my wife and I said, "Who are you? What agency are you with? Why are you threatening our neighborhood with your car and your weapons?" And one guy says, "Oh, we're threatening your neighborhood, are we?" And he reached for something back here. I thought it was a weapon. He was reaching for a weapon. He was like, it's like to intimidate you. And I said, "Wait, I have to get my brother. Let me get my brother. My brother's in the house." I said, let me go. He lives there all the time. Let me go. And I went 2 steps, and they tackled me, knocked me on the ground, and they knelt. One officer knelt on my temple here. This is a restraining hold. The other one was on my back, and my hand was under here. The other hand was in a handcuff. And as I was squished on the ground like a bug, they put something against my back. I felt a cold metal object against my back. That was the end of the taser. And then they just gave me the full volt for 5 seconds, 50,000 volts. And the thing is that the third officer was standing about 15 feet away with a .45. He's called the lethal officer because in such an operation, I might go berserk. It can happen. And so he's there to put you out of your misery if you do go berserk. And they pulled me up, and then I was handcuffed. My wife had tried to take pictures. And she had gone in the house to get a camera, and one officer was standing in front of her and says, "If you take any pictures, you'll be arrested." And so my wife said, "Well, then what would happen to the kids? If they arrest Papa and Mama, who's going to take care of the kids?" So she didn't take any pictures. They have, of course, no right to do that, but that's what they tell you, right? So they charged me. They picked me up, and suddenly I noticed that there were 10 police cars in front of my house. Actually, I think 7 or 8, but there were 12 officers. And they had all been waiting about 100 feet, 200 feet away around the corner. And they had to allow this tactical squad to do its work. The officer who led the tactical squad worked for the Department of Homeland Security because he was seconded. I'm sure that even in this town, there are officers in your local police department who are seconded to the Homeland Security. For example, when Hurricane Katrina happened, Officer Barber, the one who tasered me, he went down, put on his Homeland Security garb, and carried around an M16 rifle M16 rifle in New Orleans, the Homeland Security Army that you may have been familiar with at Katrina. So I was then picked up off the ground. I said, what are you charging me with? I called 911 because of this car. Then this car comes and attacks me. What are you charging me with? Then they became very offensive, and they wouldn't tell me. They just took me away and took me to the garage. They drove me to the garage, and the officer that was handling me was just completely abusive. He was calling my mother, who's passed away, all kinds of nasty names, and things like that. And they were just. And then when they pulled the car into the Hoffman Estates garage in the police station, there were 12 officers standing there with green rubber gloves on, surrounding the car. I thought, oh no, now I get the Chicago treatment. And I get out, and they opened the door, and I said, "You should know I'm a journalist, and I will write about whatever you do to me." And that seemed to have a sobering effect. But they charged me, eventually, when they finally found out, they charged me with assaulting these men and resisting their arrest. These are misdemeanor offenses. I fought it in a trial, 4-day trial. The trial was in June 2007, and I fought it because I had not resisted their arrest, and I had not assaulted them. But it was a very corrupt process, and I was found guilty. There was a hung jury. Then the clerk went in the back room and instructed the jury with special instructions. Then they came back with 2 convictions. And when that happened, I knew the cake was all dough. That was the end. I knew that because most American people 99% of American people, if you're in court, they assume you're guilty. But if you're found guilty after a trial with a jury, 99% of people say, he's guilty. So I said, the judge gracefully gave me that period of time where I could escape, and we escaped to Canada and went to Europe. That's the situation. 2 misdemeanors, and there's a warrant from me, from the bench warrant from the judge in Illinois. So I'm free. The extradition laws between states do not allow people to be extradited for misdemeanors. So I'm safe in 49 other states. Next question.
Assuming that that Israeli intelligence was complicit in the events of 9/11, what would be the logic, in your mind, for the involvement of Israeli intelligence for the events of 9/11?
Very good question. Thank you. That's a brilliant question. I studied Middle Eastern history. I have a degree in history from the University of California. My field of study is Israel and Palestine. In 1986, I was at the university when Benjamin Netanyahu released a book called Terrorism: How the West Can Win. And I read that book in one sitting because he talks about how he thinks, this was his spiel at the time, how the United States and other Western governments should fight the terrorism that is afflicting Israel, and that we should go after the countries that harbor such people, like Syria and Afghanistan, Iran, what have you. Now, this is the message that Benjamin Netanyahu had been promoting in books and articles and speeches since 1979. He is the founder, with his father, his late father, of an organization called the Netanyahu Institute, which was named after his brother, who was in the Entebbe raid, the Israeli intelligence, when they went down there to Entebbe and got the people back. In 1979, Netanyahu Institute had a big conference called the Jerusalem Conference, in which this idea was presented for the first time to people like George Bush. Papa Bush was there. All these high-level politicians from around the world were at this conference in Jerusalem. It's very hard to find any information about this conference, but it's very interesting. This is when the thesis of the war on terrorism was first presented to the world's leaders, which is basically, as I told you, that the Western democracies should wage war on terrorism, and the way to do that was to wage war against the countries that support terrorism, and they will tell you where the terrorism is. And as you can see now, it's like a moving show, because you can create the terrorism wherever you want. For example, this ISIS group, they talk about ISIS. You see, this is a group that is funded and trained and even supplied by the United States itself, along with Qatar and Saudi Arabia. You know, the picture of those guys driving through the desert with their Toyota trucks, those Toyota trucks they got from the United States of America. You know, John McCain in May 2013 went to Syria and met with the people who are ISIS. In fact, there's a picture of him talking to these people in an audience. He's speaking to a man with a black shirt here. John McCain is sitting here. Terry Massan of VoltaireNet in Damascus said that man he's talking to is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is the caliph of ISIS right now. Yeah? And so I know Terry Massan. His information is usually spot on. He's in Damascus. He speaks the languages. So I called John McCain's office. I wrote an article about this, one of my recent articles, and I called John McCain's office and I said, Terry Massan has said that this man in the black shirt who he's talking to in May 2013 in Damascus, or in Syria, in Aleppo or someplace like that, is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Can you tell me who this man is that John McCain is talking to? And we had a telephone call and email exchange, and they wrote back and said, that man is a fighter from the al-Nusra Front. And I wrote back and I said, you can understand that's not adequate. I need to know the name. Are you telling me that John McCain simply sat down with a fighter from al-Nusra Front and does not even know the man's name? How much sense does that make? Now, this is the thing, so that you have to understand that when you can control the extremists, when you are, like Lenin said, the best way to control the opposition is to be the opposition. So we create the monster that we then fight. It's what we did in Afghanistan too. We created Al-Qaeda. We created that group to fight the Russians, remember? So this is how the whole war on terrorism thing has been staged for us. So you know, they couldn't get us to go to war because of the chemical weapons, so they figure a few beheadings might do the trick. So and they make YouTube videos which are, you know, PG-13. Okay, kids can watch them, right? They won't be banned. So they know that people will watch this, get inflamed, and support the next aspect of the war. But Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the son of Ben-Zion Netanyahu, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, his father, was the head of the Jabotinsky element of the Likud. These are the extreme right wing who basically believe in the greater Israel and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. For example, Zev Jabotinsky, who is the founder of revisionist Zionism, always talks about the Iron Wall. He wrote an essay in 1923, I think it was called The Iron Wall, in which he says that, you know, if we want to live in Palestine as Jews, we have to build an iron wall separating us from the Palestinians. Well, we now have that iron wall. That iron wall was built by Ariel Sharon in 2002, and now it's built. It's twice as high as the Berlin Wall and 4 times longer. And if you go to places like Bethlehem, or it's surrounded by a concrete wall. I mean, it's obscene. But getting back to your question, is that they wanted to achieve this. This was a strategic goal of the Israelis, of the Likud and the Mossad, was they knew that they were overextended. They knew there were grave threats from Iraq and other countries. They needed to bring the United States into the war to fight for them, yeah? And to have permanent bases in places like Iraq and the Gulf and wherever, and so that American forces would bolster and protect them. Their hinterland would be U.S. forces. This is what they tried to achieve already in 1982 in Lebanon, but it didn't work because Reagan, instead of putting more troops in, pulled them all out after the airport bombing. But this was when Menachem Begin was first feeling he said, when the Likud came to power in 1976, my Israeli friend, I had a secular Israeli girlfriend from a kibbutz. She told me, this is the end of Israel. This is the end of Israel. She said, the terrorists have come to power. I didn't really know what she meant because I was only 19 at the time and my knowledge of Zionist history wasn't so good as hers. But this is how labor Zionists felt. Kibbutzniks and labor Zionists who thought there could be maybe some compromise with the Palestinian people saw that the extremists had come to power. Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, if you remember these people, these are terrorists. You know, it's not hyperbole. Menachem Begin was behind the blowing up of the King David Hotel, for example, in 1946. Yitzhak Shamir, these men have a lot of blood on their hands. Well, when they came to power, they fast-forwarded this idea that you have to bring the Americans in. And in 1979 already, the head of the Mossad, his name is Isar Harel, told an American Zionist that when he was asked, will terrorism come to the United States of America? And Isar Harel, the founding father of the Mossad, said, yes, it will. He says, the Arabs will attack your tallest building in New York City, which 22 years later is exactly what happened. And as soon as the buildings were hit, Ehud Barak, the commanding leader of Israel's most decorated soldier, former prime minister, former defense minister, and former commander of the Sayeret Matkal, which is an elite commando force, was in BBC studio. He was in the BBC studio ready to explain to the English-speaking world who was behind the attacks of 9/11. And he said on BBC World Television, which is seen all around the world, not in America so much, but everywhere else, he said, we know who's behind this. We know. He said, this is Osama bin Laden, and we know where he is. And the Americans have to start a concrete war on terrorism, which is exactly what became the official line. Now, so the American line, George Bush then started talking about, is exactly what Ehud Barak said. So I'll leave it at that. So they got what they wanted. They got the war on terrorism. They got the American forces there. They've got the unending war. Of course, there are companies that profit from that, but Israel is the main beneficiary. Benjamin Netanyahu, the very night of 9/11, he was asked, Mr. Netanyahu, how will this affect American-Israeli relations? And he said, this is very good. Well, not very good, but it will be great for Israeli-American relations because now you have experienced a massive hemorrhaging of blood.
Assuming that you're right.
Yes, okay.
Assuming that you're right.
Yes.
If Israel had done nothing and terrorism would be allowed to promulgate itself all over the world unabated, what would be the outcome in that? We would have 10 supermarkets blown up here in 10 cities in 10 days, and we'd have martial law in this country.
Okay, but you're missing the point. The point is that we're talking about false flag terrorism. Okay, but that means that the terrorism is not genuine. It's not Arab terrorism. The terrorism, 9/11 for example, was a manufactured terrorism, as Webster Tarpley calls synthetic terrorism. He doesn't go to who did it. But this is it. Those 19 guys from Afghanistan, the Saudis, did not do it. It was an Israeli operation. Osama bin Laden did not put nanothermite in the World Trade Center. Osama bin Laden or the Arabs did not cover up. And when you, for example, look at the cover-up. The cover-up is essential in a false flag operation because the cover-up is what protects the deception. You see, we, the American people, are the primary target of this deception. They don't care what the Afghan people think. They don't care what the Palestinians think. They don't care what the Arabs think. They care what we think. Go ahead.
70 years, family felt threatened of your personal safety since '07. And can you share any thoughts with us about Michael Hastings, I believe assassinated last year in LA?
Good question.
And MH17 as well. They're using the same playbook over and over and over. Kolomoisky took down MH17 and said Putin did it.
Right.
Thanks.
Okay, good question. Have I felt threatened? We've been threatened. We've been threatened a great deal. We've had a lot of stalking. Stalking, cyber stalking, and then actually a stalker came from Italy in after my daughter, and so we have to live with another name on the front door. The Swedish authorities do not know officially where we live, so because if they know, it'll be spread everywhere, and we'll have more stalking problems. That's the essence of it. But when you talk about Michael Hastings, I'm still alive. Go outside. Thanks very much to God. I'm still alive. But there are people like Michael Hastings who came onto big stories. He came onto big stories, and then he was suicided in a car. His car, because you understand, cars like planes can be easily hacked. It's a computer. If you know the URL, look at how the Iranians, they're very clever. American SUV, unmanned aerial vehicle, a UAV, a very fancy one, was flying over Iran. And the Iranian guys just said, hey, let's just try this, and shh. And they landed it. They took over control of the plane because the Americans hadn't thought, well, somebody might hack into your plane. Well, they did. They hacked into it and landed it and sold the technology to the Chinese and everybody else. So it's like, same thing with cars. Michael Hastings had a brand new car. He was on a hot story. He told his friends that the FBI is all over him, talking to his friends, like I had experienced. Well, and so at 3 o'clock in the morning, suddenly he's driving. He's trying to get out of town. Somebody else drives his car for him. Does a Jörg Heider. Goes 150 miles an hour. Basically, just cranks up RPMs. Shut off brake function. Bye-bye, Michael. That's what they did. And they did it with Jörg Heider. They did it with Paul Wellstone. They did it with Egypt Air 990. It's cookie-mucky, as we say in this Europe. It's very easy. Philip Marshall was a little bit different. They didn't hijack his car. They killed him in cold blood. They went into his house from the back door. Calaveras County, behind his house, there's like a slope. There's no other houses behind there. They came up the slope, went in the house, killed his sleeping children on the couch. This is so insanely brutal. They killed the little Shiatsu dog in the back room and killed him and blamed him for the murder, for the suicide of his family. Just like they did to that guy in Arizona. I forgot his name, but he was a staunch Second Amendment's right guy, and he didn't want to see any people getting shot in Occupy Phoenix, or whatever they had going down there. After the shooting of the Oakland guy, the guy got hit with the tear gas canister. They didn't want to see any shooting of these protesters, so he said, the First Amendment is protected by the Second Amendment. And he was like a little Arizona militia. He was murdered at his house too. The whole family was wiped out in Phoenix, Arizona. And they destroyed all the evidence. They went in there and cleaned up the evidence before they even let the police in. The police, if you look at the video, it's very interesting. The police in Phoenix, Arizona are saying, yeah, well, we can't go in there yet. We're waiting for them to let us go in there. Because the feds were in there cleaning up the scene. So, this is reality. So I'm very glad I'm alive, and I thank God for small favors that I'm still alive. And I'm not afraid. I've said I had a lot of anxiety coming back to America. You can't believe it. Because you see, in this community that we're in, people spread fear. There's a lot of fear-mongering. Like the paper I used to work for, American Free Press, I asked them, why do you spread fear so much? Why are you guys spreading fear? The truth should be empowering. You shouldn't be scaring people. Well, when you see a website or a newspaper that is spreading fear, you're dealing with an agent 9 times out of 10. Because fear paralyzes you. The truth and information empowers you. And it's like Kurt Vonnegut said. I use this quote. This is a great quote. Kurt Vonnegut, the author who wrote Slaughterhouse-Five, he says in The Sirens of Titan, he said, there's no reason why good should not prevail as much as evil. All you have to do is be organized, get organized. And he said, if there are such things as angels, I hope they get organized along the lines of the mafia. You see? Like these characters that did 9/11, Benjamin Netanyahu, Michael Chertoff, I call him up on the phone. I'm not afraid. I call Michael Chertoff up and I say, I'd like to speak to Michael Chertoff about his Israeli citizenship, please. You always wind up talking to some secretary or some chief of staff. They don't want, Michael won't come to the phone. He did respond to my email once, but I have no fear of calling these Israelis or any of these people. The MH17 flight, you wanted to ask, that question was?
Just your thoughts on your assessment.
MH17. Okay, very good. Yes, I think MH17 is, in my opinion, a false flag inside of a false flag. Because, you see, the rebels, the pro-Russian rebels, have no reason. There was no reason why they would shoot down that plane. Furthermore, they probably didn't have the missiles to do it. They don't have the planes to do it. What's very interesting to see, though, is that the MH17 cockpit has been seriously shot up. And it looks like from both sides, even, because there are holes that look to be from cannons or heavy machine guns. And so it looks like that Sukhoi 25, the fighter plane that the Russians saw in the proximity of the plane, is a passenger plane flying over Ukraine that had been diverted to fly over the rebel-held territory. Most unusual, because the normal route of the plane was a couple hundred miles south, so they would have been in safe territory. They were diverted, and they were diverted when they were flying over Kiev. They were diverted by the very same Kiev network, and the area they were flying over, the district of Ukraine they were flying over, the governor is an Israeli. He's actually an Israeli citizen. And they say the Sukhoi 25 is maybe can't go so high, but you have to remember that the Israelis also have Sukhoi 25s because they upgraded the plane, the Sukhoi 25, the old Soviet fighter. They upgraded it and gave it a glass cockpit with the state of Georgia. Remember Georgia, the country that also tried to start a war and thought NATO would come to their benefit? So the whole reason, and then the
Ordered 17 down, right? 35.
Yes, that's right. They told them to come down to 33 at 10,000 meters, which is exactly the ceiling, the service ceiling of the Sukhoi 25 when it's been upgraded. So the whole thing looks like, but then you say, well, the Ukrainian government, would they shoot down the plane? Would a Ukrainian military pilot shoot down a passenger plane? Well, then there's the third possibility, which is the false flag inside a false flag. That it was neither the rebels nor the Ukrainians who shot it down, but a third party, perhaps an Israeli pilot flying one of those Georgian planes, you see? Because we have many reports of foreign fighter jets being flown by foreign fighters being over the airspace of Ukraine and bombing rebel targets. And as we know, the American people haven't been given the straight scoop on what happened in Kiev. But basically, Victoria Nuland, who is Mrs. Robert Kagan. Now, who's Robert Kagan? Robert Kagan and Frederick Kagan and Donald Kagan are basically the Project for a New American Century. These are the guys who fought to get us to fight a war in Iraq. And they're the guys who wrote the paper that says that the United States must, the policy paper says, the United States must occupy Iraq, whether Saddam Hussein is there or not. Regardless of whether Saddam Hussein is in power, the United States needs to go into Iraq and create permanent bases. And as you see now, how many years we've been there? 23 years we've been fighting in Iraq. Now we have permanent bases, and the country, our policies have been followed for 23 years, and now we have a country that is de facto cut into 3 pieces. So maybe it's a matter of time before they call it a confederation, but Iraq will no longer exist as a unified nation. It will be a Kurdistan, a Shiite area, and a Sunni area, which is exactly what the Israeli plan's been all along. Oded Yinon wrote the plan in 1982 that the Israeli strategic goal for the countries in the area is to balkanize them, to cut them into pieces, just like they did Yugoslavia. Question, please.
So I got a million things going through my head, Christopher, but to help me sort this out, and perhaps some other people in here, you mentioned Greater Israel. You mentioned the Mossad. You mentioned the CIA, the FBI, all the alphabet agencies, M17, the flight that just got shot down. You have the New World Order. Can you organize that in some fashion that will make it understandable? I sort of have the gist here how that all works, but ultimately I think, are you saying that the Mossad in Israel, or not Israel necessarily, but the New World Order is created, fostered, funded by this group, or how exactly do those parts assert themselves?
Okay, that's a very good question. I have to say, what does it call that? in full disclosure. I've lived in Israel. I was married to an Israeli. I went there when I was like 18 years old. I spent a lot of time there, and I actually liked Israel when I was 18 and 19 years old. But as I studied more about the history, I had more questions. And I used to sit at the kibbutz in Israel, and we would sit up long hours and argue back and forth with Israelis, with the sons and daughters of the people who founded the state of Israel. Like on Kibbutz Afakim in the Jordan Valley where I live, the wife of Shaul Mofaz is from the same kibbutz. Shaul Mofaz is the former chief of staff of the Israeli military. So the kibbutzniks, you have to understand, the secular kibbutzniks are actually the elite Zionists of Israel. They're the ones who are, from childhood on, they are cultivated in the Zionist belief. And so when I would go to my girlfriend's grandparents' house on the Shabbat, you know, I would look at the coffee table and I would look at these books that they had on the coffee table. It was pure Zionist propaganda. And I thought, do you actually believe this stuff? And they do. They do. But for the smart ones, they realize, you know, that it's a lot of hooey, that they've been deceived. Because again, the Israelis are good people. The Israelis are really good people. I have a lot of Israeli friends. But they are also deceived. They have been deceived by the same stuff. You see, they're like the first victims, in fact. The Israelis, to be an Israeli is not a lot of fun. I don't know if Miko Peled came tonight. Is he here? He was invited. I don't know if he got the invitation. But Israelis can tell you that life in Israel is very, very hard. Men have to go and fight for 3 years in the military. Then after that, they have to spend 1 month until they're age 55 in the military. So that when Netanyahu decides to go into Gaza, for example, he calls people up. They have to leave their homes and their families and jobs and go in the hot desert and kill people and fight people they don't want to do. So the thing is that, so what is Zionism? And what is behind the state of Israel? I'll put it to you very simply. In my opinion, Israel and the army of Israel is basically the operational fist, the operational arm of the international Zionist establishment, which is based in places like London, Montreal, Toronto, New York City, Chicago, Hollywood, Las Vegas, Miami, etc., etc. But primarily London. And so that you see people like the Rothschild family. Some people don't quite like this analysis, perhaps, but the Rothschild family basically funded the Zionist enterprise. They built the first 30 settlements. They built Rishon LeZion, the first in Zion. You know, where Ben Gurion picked the grapes. Then they cultivated Ben Gurion to be the first prime minister of Israel. He was cultivated at Rishon LeZion. And Teddy Kollek. Teddy Kollek was the son of a Rothschild banker in Vienna. He's the guy that ran the arms smuggling to Palestine in the 40s from the Hotel Copacabana. You know, you remember the song Hotel Copacabana? That was Zionist headquarters. That's where they ran the illegal smuggling of weapons to Palestine. This is people like Hank Greenspun, Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky. What do these people have all in common? They are criminal. They are organized crime in the United States of America. I'm from Chicago. If you look at the Chicago history, you find that the Chicago Mafia is not Italian. It's Jewish. The guys from Lawndale. You know, Sidney Korshak. Sidney Korshak's out here in Hollywood running Hollywood, and Marilyn Monroe and the whole thing. And Sidney Korshak was the advisor on the Godfather film. Remember the Godfather film? The consigliere is Tom, I think his name is Tom. In the movie, they point out, Tom says, yeah, I'm Irish and German. Oh, spit crowd. He said some sort of thing. But they said that Tom was Irish and German. No. Sidney Korshak advised. Sidney Korshak is the one who got Al Pacino to play the part. Tom is Sidney Korshak. He's a Lithuanian Jew from the west side of Chicago. But you see, why don't they tell us that in the movie? Why do they make the consigliere, the lawyer of the mob, why do they make him an Irish Catholic or an Irish... because you see, this is misrepresentation. Hollywood always tells us that organized crime in this country is basically Italian. Wrong. The Italians, if anything, are just the gopher boys. They're the guys, and yeah, middle management. It's the Jews. And just look at Sidney Korshak. I've written a great deal. Korshak, Korshak. Just you can Google Bollyn and Korshak, or you can read the books about this Chicago mob. It's very clear. And he was, Mayor Daley's right-hand man was Sidney Korshak's brother. Yeah, that's it, Marshall Korshak. And now, Marshall Korshak's daughter is Obama's, right? It goes on and on. It's as my friend Jeff Gates writes in the book Guilt by Association, it's a transnational, transgenerational criminal syndicate. It passes generations. And what you see in Israel is the same. You see that, for example, the people who are running Israel today are the sons and daughters of the terrorists who were wanted by the British in 1946. Menachem Begin's son, Benny, Yitzhak Shamir's son, I think his name is Yair Shamir, very highly tied in 9/11. You have Tzipora Livni. She is the daughter of Eitan Livni, who was the head of operations for the Irgun. So the terrorists that were behind the expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948, the terrorists who did terrible things in places like Deir Yassin, or their sons and daughters are now the leadership of Israel. So I would just say to my Jewish friends here tonight, if you have problems with what I'm saying because you have an affinity for Israel, I just submit to you that perhaps your vision of Israel is a little bit clouded by the Hollywood perception that we've been given. And that if you just want to know a little bit more about Zionism and how it started in Eastern Europe, it didn't just grow up in the fecund soil of Belarusia. It didn't just happen because there were pogroms. It happened because the Rothschild family had sponsored a secret society called the Sons of Moses, B'nai Moshe. A society so secret that they couldn't even, if you belonged to that society, you couldn't even tell people that it existed. More secret than B'nai B'rith, you see? And so this B'nai Moshe, Sons of Moses, and another group called Hovavi Zion, Lovers of Zion, they went to the Jewish settlements, the shtetls and things like that, and told the people, you have to go to Palestine. You're Jewish, you're not Russian, you're not Ukrainian, you have to go to Israel. This is what they've been doing ever since. Just for a little footnote, Mossad, the company, the agency Mossad, originally was called Mossad Aliyah Bet. Aliyah means immigration, going up to Israel. The B part, Bet, means that it's illegal immigration. The Mossad's primary function when it started was to go to places like Greece and Yugoslavia and Russia and find Jewish communities and basically buy them, give the local chief money and say, give us your Jews. So Jews were being treated like cattle. In Yemen, Michael Chertoff's mother ran Operation Magic Carpet. She was the first Mossad LL hostess. And there was an airlift of basically all of Yemen's Jews, Yemen in the South Saudi Arabia, in the south tip of Saudi Arabia. They basically went down there and they must have given the emir of Yemen, or the sultan, whatever you call him, they must have given him a lot of gold and said, give us your Jews. And all those, it was top secret at the time, you wouldn't hear about it for years later. Those Yemenite Jews who had lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years from the time of Sheba, Queen of Sheba, they were put on planes, flown up secretly up the Red Sea, and taken to Israel. Mossad, what did they do when they needed Iraqi Jews? They needed people. They went to Baghdad, the Mossad, the Israeli immigration B, Mossad al-Aliyah Bet, and they put bombs in the synagogues in Baghdad in order to compel the Iraqi Jewish population, which was very large, to come to Israel. You see? So are those like dedicated Zionists, or what kind of Zionists are those? Those are people who are basically scared to go to Israel. You throw a bomb over there like you throw to a cattle, you put it, and the cattle all run that way. I mean, that, in my opinion, is not a savior state for the Jewish people. When you force people to go to Israel out of fear and compulsion and terrorism, that is a false Messiah. And that's my opinion. That's what I tell my friends that are Jewish and Christian Zionists. Israel is a false prophecy and a false Messiah.